At dawn on March 3, 1943, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge of his flagship. 8 destroyers escorted 8 transports packed with nearly 7,000 soldiers. Their destination was Lae in New Guinea, where reinforcements were desperately needed. Japanese naval doctrine said the convoy was safe. They had anti-aircraft guns, years of experience, and confidence built on victories from Pearl Harbor to the Java Sea. American bombers had tried before and failed. High-altitude raids scattered bombs uselessly. Torpedo attacks demanded long, straight approaches, perfect targets for gunners. Medium bombers gave plenty of time to maneuver. The Japanese expected the same again. What they could not know was that the Americans had changed the rules of the game. In workshops in Australia, mechanics and pilots had transformed the ordinary B-25 Mitchell into a ship killer. The nose of the bomber, once home to a bombardier's station, now bristled with up to 8 50-caliber machine guns. Each gun fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds, capable of tearing through thin steel plating, shredding gun crews, and setting fires across a ship's decks. Firing together, the modified bombers could unleash nearly 7,000 rounds per minute, a wall of destruction no warship could endure. Coupled with a daring new tactic called skip bombing, these machines turned into the deadliest threat Japanese convoys had ever faced. Skip bombing demanded skill and courage. Pilots flew at mast height toward their target, barely above the sea. At just the right distance, they released their bombs, which skipped across the water like stones before slamming into a ship's hull. The technique required precise timing, but when mastered, it delivered accuracy high-altitude bombers could never achieve. Combined with the heavy guns of the strafer B-25s, it meant ships would be pounded with gunfire before bombs even arrived. The Japanese Navy had trained for many threats, but not this. That morning, Japanese lookouts spotted American formations at 7,000 feet. It looked familiar. Another attempt at high-altitude bombing. Gun crews manned their positions, confident they could repel the attack. 5-inch guns, dozens of 25mm cannons, and light machine guns filled the sky with tracer fire. It was exactly what the Americans wanted. While every Japanese gun pointed skyward, the real strike came in low from the horizon. Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters and B-25 strafers thundered in at wave-top level, their propeller wash spraying the sea. Major Ed Larner led the first wave. In his bomber nicknamed Ruthless, he charged directly at the destroyer Shirayuki. From 1,200 yards, he opened fire, 8 machine guns blazing. Hundreds of rounds ripped into the bridge and superstructure, killing officers in seconds. Survivors later compared the attack to being caught in a giant metal saw. With its command gone, Shirayuki fell silent. Seconds later, 2 skip bombs slammed into her side. Explosions tore through her hull, breaking her back. The destroyer rolled heavily and began to sink. All along the convoy, similar scenes unfolded. Other B-25s raked transports from bow to stern, silencing gun positions before dropping bombs that tore through their holds. The Beaufighters added their own fury with 20mm cannons, focusing fire on bridges and gun crews. One transport after another burst into flames or began to sink. Soldiers packed into cargo spaces had little chance of escape. Eyewitnesses described the horror of hearing screams from flooded holds, even as more bombs exploded overhead. Within minutes, the convoy was chaos. The destroyer Arashio tried to shield the transports by maneuvering between them and the attackers. Instead, she became the next target. 3 B-25s concentrated on her, their combined firepower shredding the bridge and killing the captain. Skip bombs tore open her hull, leaving her rudder jammed. Out of control, Arashio collided with the transport Nojima. The two ships locked together as flames spread across both decks. Kimura could hardly believe what he saw. His carefully guarded convoy, which doctrine said should survive any air attack, was collapsing around him. The Americans were not flying torpedo runs or clumsy, high-altitude bombing patterns. They were charging in at point-blank range, machine guns blazing, bombs skipping across the water, overwhelming defenses before gunners could respond. Evasive maneuvers offered no escape. Every ship in the formation became a target. The slaughter lasted only 15 minutes. By the time the last B-25 pulled away, burning ships littered the sea. Transports that carried thousands of soldiers were torn apart, their decks wrecked, and their cargo holds flooded. Survivors jumped into the water, only to face more horror as Allied aircraft strafed lifeboats and swimmers to prevent any reinforcements from reaching shore. The air was filled with fire, smoke, and the cries of drowning men. Of the 8 transports that left Rabaul, all were lost. 4 destroyers also went down, including Kimura's flagship. The survivors, who managed to cling to life in the sea, waited for submarines to rescue them after dark. Of the nearly 7,000 troops meant to reinforce Leh, fewer than 1,200 survived. For the Japanese Army in New Guinea, it was a disaster. For the Japanese Navy, it was worse, a revelation that their doctrine was broken and their convoys vulnerable. The impact reached far beyond the battlefield. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, immediately grasped what it meant. If surface convoys could not be protected, then forward garrisons could not be supplied. From that day, Japanese shipping across the Southwest Pacific faced a new, relentless threat. The modified B-25s became known as strafers. Field conversions soon gave way to factory models. North American aviation incorporated the 8-gun nose into new production lines, eventually creating versions that carried up to 18 forward-firing guns. These aircraft, flying with the 5th Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force, became the scourge of Japanese supply lines. Daylight movements of ships larger than fishing boats became suicidal. Japanese logistics shifted to submarines and high-speed destroyer runs under cover of night. But these methods could deliver only a fraction of what the Army needed. Starvation and shortages spread across the Pacific garrisons. The strafer tactics spread quickly. American squadrons developed new attack profiles, combining heavy forward fire with precision skip bombing. Pilots practiced against derelict ships near Port Moresby until they could strike with deadly accuracy. Crews decorated their aircraft with fearsome nose art and nicknames like Dirty Dora, Hell's Angel, and Pluto. Their culture celebrated aggressiveness and innovation. Many pilots admitted the missions felt suicidal, yet they flew again and again. The Japanese tried to adapt. More light anti-aircraft guns were bolted onto decks. Some captains attempted radical maneuvers, stopping engines or reversing course suddenly. A few fighter pilots even attempted ramming attacks against B-25s. None of it worked. The volume of firepower unleashed by a strafer could silence defenses in seconds, and skip bombs continued to find their marks. By late 1943, the effect was undeniable. Japanese reports described the B-25 strafer as the most feared weapon in the Pacific. Convoys were abandoned, ports were raided, and harbors once considered safe were turned into graveyards. Operations that would have been routine a year earlier were now impossible. The strategic balance had shifted. The legacy of the strafer extended far beyond World War II. The idea of turning transport or bomber aircraft into flying gun platforms influenced later designs. In Vietnam, the AC-47 and AC-130 gunships carried forward the concept. In modern times, the A-10 Thunderbolt II Odritonen Turndin Down 2, with its massive cannon designed for low-level attacks, can be traced back to the lessons of the Bismarck Sea. For Japan, the psychological damage was as severe as the material loss. Survivors told of nightmares haunted by the sight of 8 flashing muzzles bearing down at sea level. Commanders admitted their doctrines had failed completely. One officer later wrote that the B-25s destroyed not only ships, but also the entire concept of how the Imperial Navy believed war at sea should be fought. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked the turning point. It was not the largest battle of the Pacific, nor the most famous. But in those brief minutes over the waves, the Japanese discovered that ingenuity and improvisation could be as deadly as any battleship. A few modified bombers, armed with machine guns and flown with courage, had dismantled an empire's ability to fight. The sea that morning became their graveyard. The story of the strafer is ultimately one of innovation under pressure. Mechanics in makeshift workshops, officers willing to try unorthodox ideas, and crews prepared to risk their lives at mast height all combined to change the course of the war. The 8-gun nose of the B-25 was more than a modification. It was a symbol of adaptation, of turning weakness into strength, and of how quickly the balance of power can shift when imagination meets necessity. By the end of the war, strafers had sunk or damaged hundreds of Japanese ships. Their missions were dangerous, their losses real, but their impact undeniable. Veterans who flew them remembered the vibration of 8 guns firing at once, the smell of cordite in the cockpit, the sight of enemy ships breaking apart beneath them. They knew they had flown something unique, an improvised weapon that proved decisive. On March 3, 1943, Admiral Kimura believed he was leading a secure convoy through familiar waters. By mid-morning, he was watching his command torn to pieces in a way no naval officer had ever imagined. The B-25 strafer had arrived, and with it, the end of Japanese dominance in the Southwest Pacific.